Legendary blues artist Robert Johnson dies at the age of 27 under very mysterious circumstances.
Before he died, he crawled on his hands and knees and barked like a dog.
As they say, they slipped him a Mickey.
He dies penniless and unknown, and at the time, no one could have predicted the value of the music he left behind.
It's the greatest rags to riches story in the history of rags to riches stories.
Or the number of people competing for a piece of his estate.
You know, he just pops up out of nowhere saying that, hey, I'm Robert Johnson's son.
Leaving a trail of broken hearts behind him. It's not easy to know who's telling the truth about this enigmatic ladies' man.
People today may not know Robert Johnson by name, but if you mention, he's the guy that sold his soul to the devil, they've all heard of that.
Robert Johnson is considered the most influential blues musician of all time, inspiring the likes of Eric Clapton, Led Zeppelin, and even Mick Jagger. He was among the first to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and has been credited with laying the foundation for rock music. Even more amazing is that the man who accomplished so much was only 27 when he died. August 16, 1938, Greenville, Mississippi. Robert Johnson lies inside a stranger's home, doubled over in pain. No one knows for sure what's wrong with him. Only 3 days before, he was performing at a country dance hall. Johnson has been playing gigs in the area since July. He has good reason to stick around. A woman has caught his eye.
Apparently, he had taken up with a woman here in Greenwood who was the wife of the man who ran the juke joint out at Three Forks. Robert Johnson would approach a woman if he liked her, if he was attracted to her. It didn't matter whether she was married, if her husband was sitting right next to her. He'd make a play for her.
What happens next is uncertain, but there is one popular myth.
And of course, the owner wasn't too crazy about that. He knew that Uncle Robert was a drinker. And so, as they say, they slipped him a Mickey.
And as legend has it, it happened during a performance at the juke joint.
Robert was brought an open bottle of whiskey, and as he began to drink, it was knocked from his hand. And he told the person who knocked it from his hand, "Don't ever knock away a bottle of whiskey from my hand." And they said, "Don't ever drink from an open bottle. You don't know what could have happened to it." And then when another bottle open was brought to Robert, he drank from it.
No one knows for sure who served Robert the spiked drink, but one of the most common beliefs is that the juke joint owner did it because he was racked by jealousy. Hours later, he becomes ill.
He attempted to play some requests from people who knew his records, and he eventually collapsed and was taken into a back room and laid down.
Back in the United States, and particularly in the South, in the 1930s, the murder weapon of choice was arsenic or cyanide. People didn't have guns. Not that way.
Robert is taken into the home of one of his female fans, but no one can afford to bring in a doctor. After 3 days of excruciating pain, he dies.
Well, from all reports, before he died, he crawled on his hands and knees and barked like a dog.
His death certificate reads, "No doctor" as the official cause. Robert's body is reportedly buried in a graveyard nearby, where he will remain relatively forgotten for the next 30 years. Much like his death, the life of Robert Johnson is shrouded in mystery. It starts in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. 1910, Robert Johnson's mother, Julia Major Dodds, has been abandoned by her husband. She starts up an affair with field hand Noah Johnson.
I was told by Robert Johnson's half-sister that whenever Mr. Johnson would come around to visit his mother, she would ask little Carrie and whoever else happened to be around the place at that time to go outside and play for a while.
Enough of this, lady.
Well, you know what?
Soon, Julia is pregnant with Noah Johnson's child, but the good times don't last. Robert Johnson is born on May 8, 1911. But Julia doesn't stay with his father, Noah. 5 years later, she remarries to a farmer named Dusty Willis. Robert's half-sister Carrie helps her mother to raise him and his other siblings. As a teenager, Robert develops a passion for musical instruments, in particular the harmonica and jaw harp. It causes friction with his stepfather, Dusty.
Dusty always wanted Robert to work, and Robert always wanted to get out of it and find other things to do.
Carrie, on the other hand, encourages her brother's interest in music and even buys Robert his first guitar.
The relationship between my grandmother and Robert Johnson was very close. She spoke of him often and very fondly so.
But Robert doesn't take up music full time. He falls in love with Virginia Travis, and they marry in February 1929.
I think Robert focused on her and having a family and settling down. He was not a professional musician at that time. He was a wannabe. He was very much enchanted by music and loved it, but he was willing to be a farmer for her.
Before long, Virginia is pregnant. The newlyweds are happy, but a year after they are married, things take a dark turn. Virginia dies in childbirth.
It was the end of a lot of things for Robert. He had wanted to be a farmer, but certainly only for her. And he wanted to have this baby, very likely because he loved her so much. And it just wasn't going to happen. She was gone.
Where's the baby? Where's the baby?
The baby, too, is gone. Virginia's family and the community blame the deaths on Robert's love of the devil's music. In his grief, music is the only thing that can console Robert.
And so the next thing we know about Robert is that he's gone. He's in a little place called Martinsville in southern Mississippi, back down where he was born. And it was there that he was, his fire was lit for this kind of music that he was going to be involved in.
Johnson's music may take away his grief, but he won't have long to enjoy his success.
John Hammond wanted Robert Johnson to appear at a concert at Carnegie Hall in New York in 1938.
But Johnson was dead by the time Hammond sent the word out to bring him to New York.
Blues musician Robert Johnson is devastated by the death of both his wife and child. He turns to music to deal with his grief, beginning a journey that would later turn him into a legend. (1930) Mississippi. Robert Johnson travels throughout the Delta, playing music wherever he can. He's known for charming the ladies every place he goes.
He liked to mesmerize the women, as I would say. Married, single, didn't matter. He was, when he performed and he got a little looker in him, he was a woman's man.
In 1931, Robert marries Coletta Callie Kraft, an older woman with 3 children of her own.
She took very good care of him. She brought him breakfast in bed. She cooked for him and washed for him and did all sorts of things that a wife would do for a man, and he loved it.
But this time, Robert is unable to settle down. He leaves and never comes back. 5 years later, in 1936, Robert heads to Jackson, Mississippi to become a professional musician. He eventually meets Ernie Ortle, a talent scout for the American Record Company.
And it was through Mr. Ortle that Robert Johnson was eventually taken to Texas to record.
Robert records 16 tracks, including Kind-Hearted Woman Blues and Sweet Home Chicago. Decades later, musicians like Keith Richards would be in awe over Robert's unique sound.
He could play a guitar with 2 hands and make it sound like there were 2 guitars being played by 4 hands. No one has ever figured out how he did it, to this day. There's an interesting story that is told that he faced the wall while he made those recordings. Some people think that he just wanted to concentrate. Some other people think that he didn't want anyone else seeing his technique.
One of the tracks was Terraplane Blues, which turned out to be Johnson's biggest hit. It sold 5,000 copies. Now, in those days, for a rural recording of black blues played in solo acoustic style, that was a lot of records. So he became a household name in the households that appreciated that kind of music.
The following year, Johnson records Traveling Riverside Blues and Hellhound on My Trail. Robert is paid in cash for the songs, but never receives any royalties.
He wasn't making much, if any, money. He may have made a few $100s from the recordings he made in 1936 and 7, but he was essentially a pauper.
Record companies did own the rights. They paid for it, and that was it. They owned it. They paid you to make the records, and see ya.
Producer and talent scout John H. Hammond hears Robert Johnson's music and searches him out.
John Hammond wanted Robert Johnson to appear at a concert at Carnegie Hall in New York in 1938.
After spending years playing to small crowds in country dance halls and juke joints, it would be his largest show to date. But then on August 16, 1938, Robert Johnson dies.
Johnson was dead by the time Hammond sent the word out to bring him to New York.
After his death, Robert remains in the shadows, a distant memory until 1961, when Columbia Records releases his album King of the Delta Blues Singers. It's not a commercial success, but does influence aspiring musicians like Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton.
He was a revolutionary, he was a pioneer, he had a style like none other, and he wrote music like none other. Today, he is credited with having laid the musical foundation for rock and roll.
But it takes another 13 years before Robert Johnson's notoriety really takes off, thanks to music historian Steve Levere.
I was working in a record store in Las Vegas in 1961 when the very first King of the Delta Blues Singers came out on Columbia Records. It was the first full album devoted to a pre-war blues musician. And my coworker asked me, she said, "Have you heard this record?" And I said, "No." And she said, you better listen to it. It took me quite a while to get used to listening to Robert, but of course once I did, I saw the beauty of it and loved it ever since. But that first album didn't tell me much about Robert Johnson, so a mystery is building in my mind.
In 1973, Levere tracks down Robert's half-sister Carrie. They strike a deal that will turn Robert Johnson into a blues legend.
I did some research and found out that the intellectual property that she had inherited from her brother, which were the compositions, they had never been copyrighted, and so the songs were still available. And I said, by the way, do you happen to have a picture of your brother? And she said, you know, I do. I said, great, I want to see that too.
In fact, Carrie possesses the only known photographs of her brother, and they will become extremely valuable.
When Carrie Thompson brought that photograph of Robert Johnson and put it in my hands, I took one look at it and I said to myself, is this an album cover or what? It was a remarkable photograph. He's all decked out in a pinstripe suit and a hat, patent leather shoes, and a guitar that looks like it's seen 40 miles of bad road, and it was just a great, great picture.
November 20th, 1974. Inspired by the photographs, Steve Levere proposes an idea to Carrie.
I told Carrie that I thought we could do something remarkable for both of us. She had the inheritance, I had the energy and the time.
Levere wants to ensure that Carrie can represent Johnson's interests and sign a deal. As Johnson's only living sibling, Carrie believes that she is her brother's next of kin and tells this to Levere.
Carrie Thompson represented that she was the sole heir of Robert Johnson, and she believed she was. She didn't know of anyone else, and she thought she had good reason to know if there would have been anyone else.
Robert Johnson's sister Carrie enters into a contract with Levere, handing over her purported rights to 2 photographs and, more importantly, all of Robert's musical works and recordings. Typically, agents earn roughly 15 to 25% at most, but Levere gets 50%.
Agents often get a cut, but they don't get ownership. Somehow or other, Levere succeeded in getting Carrie Thompson or her lawyer to agree to this.
Steve Levere insists everything was above board.
She had an attorney. I asked her if she had one. She said yes, and I said, okay, we'll have your attorney communicate with my attorney and we'll write an agreement that essentially gives me the right to do what I want to do with this property. And she said, okay, so that's what we did.
But I think what is so important with Levere's efforts is that he made sure that the music and the photographs were copyrighted, which had never been done.
With Robert Johnson's music rights and photographs in tow, Levere starts shopping for a record deal.
I called John Hammond at Columbia Records and told him what I'd found, and he was very excited about it, and he said, we've got to do something with this. And I said, well, great, that's the way I feel. I think we ought to repackage both of the King of the Delta blues singers with this photograph on the cover of both of the albums.
But the process is slow going, and Carrie is frustrated with the deal.
In 1980, she became very unhappy with Levere. She felt he hadn't performed, he hadn't accounted, she had not received any money, nothing was happening.
Carrie decides to overturn the contract.
Levere tried to renegotiate it, he tried to make a new deal with her. He hoped he could change her mind.
But whether or not the contract was actually rescinded is unclear.
Carrie Thompson did make some efforts to try to rescind the contract, but she never did. She hired a number of attorneys, but the contract that Carrie Thompson signed with Steve Levere was never rescinded.
There is, I believe, a significant argument that the contract was rescinded and that Levere, at that point, no longer had any authority as the representative of Carrie Thompson. He believes he does, and we are still arguing that question.
Levere continues working on the re-release of Robert Johnson's work. And it's about to go big, making some people very rich while leaving others out in the cold.
She didn't receive anything, but very little money for what she did. There's been Grammys issued, awards issued. She got none of that.
Rock and Roll Hall of Famer and blues icon Robert Johnson passes away without leaving a will or any known descendants. Half a century later, agent Steve Levere signs a deal with Johnson's half-sister Carrie to turn her brother into a household name. Steve Levere works hard for the release of Robert Johnson's music, but it's slow going.
As Steve Levere worked with Columbia, they had some turnover, and people would come and go, and there'd be some interest in the project, and then nothing would happen. Steve Levere wouldn't give up. He continued to push for Columbia to put out the complete recordings.
By 1981, Carrie is growing ill, and she issues power of attorney to her half-sister Annie C. Anderson. In February 1983, Carrie dies. In her will are two codicils. One states that she has rescinded her contract with Levere, while she leaves Johnson's music and photographs to Annie and her grandson, Robert Harris.
Annie Anderson was appointed by Carrie Thompson as what's in Maryland called her personal representative, which is the equivalent of the executor, the person who administers the estate. And Annie and Robert were named as her sole heirs in equal parts.
But since the validity of the contract is unclear, Levere carries on.
So he continued to act on behalf of the contract, claiming that he didn't know who her heirs were.
Annie Anderson files the will in Maryland, hoping the judicial system will help her fulfill Carrie's last wishes. But as the heir presumptive, she may not have been Robert Johnson's successor in the first place.
Mrs. Anderson was a half-sister of Mrs. Thompson, but she was no kin to Robert Johnson. We might say here in the South that she was on the other side of the family, but they are the ones that opened the estate. Mr. Harris was a relative, only a very collateral and distant relative of Robert Johnson.
Carrie Thompson's rights to her brother's estate were never questioned before because at the time of his death, his estate wasn't worth anything. But there's about to be more to fight for. In 1990, Columbia Records finally releases the 2-CD set of Robert Johnson, the complete recordings. Levere is listed as producer, and the album goes platinum. It even wins a Grammy Award for Best Historical Album. It generates more than $2 million, but with Robert Johnson's heir still undetermined, Annie and Harris don't see any of it. Instead, half of the royalties get funneled into the Johnson estate.
It's the only set of pre-war blues records that has attained that number of sales.
Despite his success, the secret behind Robert Johnson's talent remains a mystery. New Africa, Mississippi, 1931. Broken after the death of his first wife, Virginia, Robert Johnson now has only one thing on his mind: learning to master the guitar. Robert meets noted blues musicians Son House and Charlie Patton, though he fails to impress them.
Whenever they would put down their instruments, he would pick it up and try to play something, and he was just awful. Son House said people would come to me and say, "Man, go get that kid off of that guitar. He's driving us crazy." So Son would have to go in the juke joint and say, "Man, put that guitar down. You can't play nothing."
Robert is more determined than ever to master the guitar.
He went away for a while and came back, and he was doing all these different riffs and chord progressions and everything. They couldn't explain how he could not play one minute and then the next minute he could play better than everybody else.
It's said that upon his return, he's able to play any song in any genre after only hearing it once. It seems to happen so quickly that it raises suspicion. Legend has it that Robert Johnson's talent came from making a deal with the devil himself.
Apparently, you were supposed to go down to a crossroads. You take your guitar with you. You sit down. You play your best song. You know, you trim your fingernails back till they bleed. You play your best song, and the whole time you're sitting there wishing that, you know, wanting the devil to come, and eventually he would walk up.
A guitar player could go to a crossroads with a guitar and expect that the black man would take his guitar from him and tune it and give it back to him, and at that point in time, you'd be able to play. The person who owned the guitar would be able to play anything he wanted to play, but it would cost him his soul. People today may not know Robert Johnson by name, but if you mention, you know, he's the guy that sold his soul to the devil, they've all heard of that.
In reality, it's more likely that he developed his talent after spending time with guitarist Ike Zinnerman.
Ike took him under his wing and taught him how to play and how to make a cohesive unit out of the pieces of music that he was playing. And Ike's wife told me that they would sit up all night, some nights, knees to knees, in two chairs across from one another, playing guitar to one another and studying each other's manner of playing. And that's really how Robert Johnson became a professional musician.
Despite Robert Johnson's undisputed talent, Stephen Nevis says without the photos, Robert Johnson would have remained relatively unknown.
We believe the photographs are the reason that Columbia Records, which became Sony, issued and reissued the Robert Johnson music in the 2-CD set in 1990 and has since issued a number of others. We believe that without those photographs, that never would have happened because they added dimensions to the life of a musician who only had left recordings.
As Carrie Thompson's heir, Robert Harris thinks his grandmother was instrumental in helping turn Robert Johnson into a blues legend, even if most of his accolades happened after her death.
She didn't receive anything but very little money for what she did. There's been Grammys issued, awards issued. She got none of that.
But others see things a bit differently. Without Levere, there would be no Robert Johnson as we know the blues legend today.
Stephen Levere spent countless years researching the man and the music and the myth, and was really in a great position to tell the story of Robert Johnson like no one had done before him. And so had he not done that and secured the copyrights to the music and the photographs, then the music and the photographs could have fallen into the public domain.
And if all had fallen into the public domain, then no one would have made any money. Luckily for some, that's not what happened.
Steve Levere and Sony earned millions from the 2-CD set. Carrie Thompson got $300. That was it. Nothing more, nor have her heirs seen another penny.
The photographs grace the front and back covers of the album jacket.
I feel like they thumbed their nose up at us, you know. and they've just gone on about their business and forgotten all about us.
But it is in 1992 that lawyer Jim Kitchens gives the Robert Johnson case the biggest shakeup yet.
He said, yeah, Robert Johnson was my daddy.
Blues icon Robert Johnson passes away in 1938. And for more than half a decade, it is believed that he died without any descendants, entitling his half-sister as the closest relative to his estate.
Under Mississippi law, Carrie Thompson, as the sole heir and the closest relative, would be entitled to the Robert Johnson estate. However, with a son or a spouse, the son or the child or spouse would be the heir over Carrie Thompson.
In 1991, the Leflore County Chancery Court, in its search for legitimate heirs, deals a blow to Annie, Carrie's half-sister and legal heir.
What the court did was it removed Annie Anderson as the executor of the estate, saying she's an heir and therefore had a conflict of interest, although heirs are very often executors of estates.
Willis B. Brumfeld, Chancery Clerk of Leflore County, is chosen to replace her.
And Brumfield, in turn, hired Stephen Levere as his agent, his expert, to help determine who the heirs were.
A petition is sent out calling on any potential heirs of Robert Johnson's to come forward.
There were a good many others who claimed to be some sort of cousin or some other kind of relative of Robert Johnson. People saw money and they started trying to get their hand in the pot.
After false heirs come out of the woodwork, in 1992, Mississippi lawyer Jim Kitchens comes forward with a bombshell. He announces that he has found Robert Johnson's illegitimate son, Claude Johnson. Hazelhurst, Mississippi, 1931. Robert Johnson has been on the road playing music since the death of his wife a year before. During a stop into Hazelhurst, he meets Virgie Smith, a girl who likes to go to parties from time to time.
My grandmother told me that Robert Johnson was her first boyfriend, her first love. And she was really, in love with him.
Robert also falls for the 17-year-old and allegedly asks her parents for permission to marry her, but they refuse. The two part ways.
Because her dad was a Southern Baptist preacher. And during those times, the blues was considered the devil's music.
December 16, 1931, Lincoln County, Mississippi. Virgie Smith gives birth to a baby boy. Claiming the baby is Robert's, she names him Claude Johnson. Claude is raised mostly by his Baptist grandfather, a sharecropper. Upon hearing news that he has a son, Robert visits Virgie.
Robert Johnson came the first time looking for Claude's mother. And Claude was out front, and his grandparents made him go inside. They knew who Robert Johnson was, knew him by sight, and they would not allow Claude to go out and see him or touch him. The Smiths were sincere in their religious convictions, and they did not want their daughter to have anything to do with anybody that played the blues. The next time he came, he knew that the mother was not there. So Claude knows that Robert Johnson came to the Smith home, to his grandparents' home, to see him, and that's very important to him. Again, the grandparents wouldn't let him talk to Robert Johnson.
A few years later, Claude's mother, Virgie, marries Marshall Pletchakane, and she moves away from home.
When Claude tried to live with his mother and his stepfather, the stepfather was very, very hard on him and treated him very differently from the way he treated his own children.
It's Claude's grandparents who reveal his true father's name, that he is none other than blues singer Robert Johnson.
Claude had been told by his grandparents, upon whom he totally relied, that Robert was his father, and this information developed before there was a penny to be had from the music of Robert Johnson. So there was no motive for him ever to fabricate anything about it.
My dad knew that he was Robert Johnson's son all along, but even my dad didn't know the significance of Robert Johnson and the name and who he really was, because, he was never in his life.
Years later, in 1989, Claude Johnson learns that the estate of Robert Johnson is looking for rightful heirs. Not sure what to do, Claude drops into the office of longtime friend and prominent trial attorney Jim Kitchens.
He was a little bit reticent, I think, to broach the subject with me, but he said, "Jim, do you know who Robert Johnson was?" And I said, "Sure, he was the father of the blues." So Claude said, "Well, that was my daddy." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, Robert Johnson was my daddy." And this hit me like a ton of bricks, because I knew how important Robert Johnson is to the music world.
Jim becomes his attorney, and before long, Claude is summoned to appear before the court.
I'm suspicious of Claude Johnson in just how the whole situation came about. He just pops up out of nowhere and saying that, "Hey, I'm Robert Johnson's son."
As Carrie's heir, Annie Anderson files a motion to dismiss Claude's claim, arguing that it is too little too late. Initially, the courts agree, but then it is decided that Claude can continue his heirship proceedings. Finally, in 1998, Claude is given the chance to argue his claim, and the trial begins. For Annie Anderson and Robert Harris, designated heirs by Robert's half-sister Carrie in her will, it is a shock to have a stranger on the scene, claiming to be Robert's son. To them, Claude is another charlatan trying to rob them of the family's legacy and Johnson's millions.
Being as close as my grandmother and my uncle were, Claude Johnson is somebody that we never heard about in the family.
When Annie and Harris's lawyer look into Claude's case, the thing that raises a red flag is Claude's name.
He identified himself when he got his Social Security card, and later, I believe, his driver's license, as Claude Kane. And in fact, Claude had lived for a better part of his life as Claude Kane, not as Claude Johnson.
As far as Claude's opponents are concerned, things just aren't adding up.
Claude explained he used the name Kane because Mr. Kane threatened him and was abusive to him, and what he implied but never said was that Mr. Kane did not want him to be using the name Johnson. We wondered about that because Claude only lived with Marshall Kane for 2 years. He spent most of his growing up life with his grandparents, the Smiths.
A month before Claude turns 21, he begins using his biological father's name.
And he went down to the courthouse and got a marriage license. And that is the first record that appears that was generated by Claude Johnson, in which he, in effect, forsook the Kane name and took the Johnson name, which was his legal name.
To prove Claude's claim, Jim Kitchens brings in a videotaped deposition from Eula May, who was not only Claude's mother Virgie's friend, but also her aunt, making her Claude Johnson's great aunt. Virgie Smith is just 17 when she goes to see Robert Johnson perform at a country dance hall in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. She's with her friends Eula May and Eula's boyfriend. At the end of his song, the four go for a walk.
They decided that they were going to leave the rest of the people and go out into the woods. And they went into the woods, and to hear Miss Eula May tell it, they did what came naturally.
Miss Eula May, she was very forthcoming. She was very erudite, and she was very graphic in her descriptions of the events that had resulted in the birth of Claude Johnson.
When she was asked during her deposition if they had sex, she said, well, we didn't know to call it that then, but that's what I understand people are calling it today, and that's what we did.
You're saying to me that you were watching them make love while you were making love. You don't think that's at all odd? Have you ever done that before? Or since? Watch other people make love?
Yes, I have done it before. Yes, I've done it after I married, yes.
You watched other people make love?
Yes, sir.
Other than Mr. Johnson and Virgie King?
Right.
Really?
You have?
No, really haven't.
I'm sorry for you.
But not everyone is convinced by Eula May's story. A DNA test is the next obvious solution to determine whether Claude is a legitimate heir to Robert Johnson's fortune.
It would prove once and for all, that he is who he claims to be. I think that's something that needs to be done. In my opinion, I think a lot of people would like to know, for sure.
But there's a hitch. No one knows for certain where Robert Johnson is buried.
There are 3 official grave sites of a man who died in 1938 and was placed into an unmarked grave.
So you go to digging up DNA back there, you don't know who you're gonna dig up.
Claude Johnson is determined to prove that he is blues icon Robert Johnson's flesh and blood, putting him in line to inherit millions of dollars of royalties. But there are obstacles in his way. The next obvious step is to do DNA testing.
So if you're trying to do DNA testing on Robert Johnson, where are you gonna find his body? That's a mystery in itself.
It's just an impossibility. There are 3, official grave sites for Robert Johnson. 3 official grave sites of a man who died in 1938 and was placed into an unmarked grave.
When I talked to Claude Johnson's lawyer, he said, it was probably a shallow grave and it's under an almond tree, and the almond tree roots have probably destroyed the remains. So even if he is there, it would be not productive to do it.
An alternative could be taking DNA samples from Carrie Thompson and comparing them with Claude Johnson. But bodies are usually only exhumed for criminal cases.
So you go to digging up DNA back there, you don't know who you're gonna dig up.
What Claude Johnson does have going for him is a birth certificate from the state of Mississippi, listing his father's name, R.L. Johnson. Through Levere's research, he discovers that Robert Johnson went by none other than R.L. Johnson at the time when Claude was born, the same initials on Claude's birth certificate.
At that point, I said, yeah, he's bona fide. Nobody could make that up. And they'd have to know that R.L. was Robert Johnson.
But according to attorney Stephen Nevis, the birth certificate isn't valid.
Mississippi state regulations require that before the father of a child can be certified or put down on a birth certificate as being the father has to consent. The mother simply can't name anyone she chooses or someone she believes to be the father.
The alleged R.L. initials, and thus the paternity of Claude Johnson, could belong to someone else.
What we found interesting was that one of Robert Johnson's closest friends who lived in Memphis, was known as RL.
But this argument isn't enough to turn the case. In October 1998, in the face of all the evidence presented, Claude Johnson is declared to be the biological son and sole heir of Robert Johnson. This entitles him to an initial inheritance of more than $1.3 million.
That's basically, I'm not satisfied in my mind that he's, that he's a relative.
Not ready to give up what was left to them in Carrie Thompson's will, Robert Harris and Annie Anderson launch an appeal. On March 21, 2000, they also file a second lawsuit against Claude Johnson, along with music historian Steve Levere and Sony Music Entertainment Incorporated. Their complaint alleges fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of the 1974 contract Levere had signed with Johnson's half-sister Carrie, concerning the right to use photographs of Robert Johnson commercially in exchange for royalties.
The pictures belonged to my grandmother's estate and was never a part of the Robert Johnson estate. Without my grandmother's input, pictures, liner notes, there would be no Robert Johnson music collection. What we're looking for is compensation, of course, but mostly what we want is recognition.
Claude Johnson's lawyers don't agree.
The problem is that Annie Anderson, when she filed accountings on behalf of the estate, she identified the music, the name, the likeness of Robert Johnson. She also identified the two photographs of Robert Johnson as being assets of the estate. And that was all fine and good for Annie Anderson to do when she thought she was going to inherit the estate. But it wasn't until after Claude was determined the heir, to the exclusion of all others, Annie Anderson then came out and said, no, these weren't part of the estate. These were Carrie Thompson's assets.
A second lawsuit over the rights to the photographs still rages on. But Harris and Anderson lose their appeal, and Claude remains the rightful heir to Robert Johnson's fortune. In 2002, Claude Johnson is handed a six-figure check.
It's the greatest rags to riches story in the history of rags to riches stories. At the time that Mr. Claude was adjudicated the sole heir at law and the Supreme Court had ruled in his favor, there was about $1.5 million that had accumulated in the estate.
In addition to the new financial windfall, Robert Johnson's heritage honors Claude in another way. Prestigious Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement. Eventually, Claude establishes the Robert Johnson Blues Foundation in his father's memory.
The foundation each year gives scholarships to people attending various music schools. We have different festivals throughout the year, and we have musical contests where we select someone who's under the age of 18 to be the Robert Johnson Award winner for that year, present them with a Gibson guitar, a Robert Johnson signature Gibson guitar.
Despite the battle for his royalties, Robert Johnson's music lives on. He is still a favorite among blues fans.
Robert Johnson is extraordinarily popular all over the world. Worldwide, Robert Johnson is just a blues icon, and he is seen as really the father of the Delta style of blues.
Johnson's music is so special because it's a culmination of all that came before, and it's the beginning of everything that came after. It's a watershed period of time when Robert Johnson created his music and recorded it. He was years ahead of his time.
For Robert Johnson's grandson, Stephen, the mystery surrounding his otherworldly talent and his death is just part of the legacy.
Basically, because of the way he lived, the way he died, and the legacy that he was supposedly have left behind. There's going to always be doubt, there's going to be questions, but when you think about that, that keeps everything exciting about Robert Johnson.